Hello and welcome to Welty at Home, the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. We are currently discussing To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, and today is our final discussion on this wonderful series. We will be covering sections 8 through 13 in this discussion. And even though it's sad to leave one book behind, stay until the end, because as our tradition goes, we will announce the next book club series at the end of this discussion. So don't miss that. I'm Jessica Russell, director of the Eudora Welty House and Garden, and am so happy to be joined by our guest moderator, Virginia Woolf scholar, Susan Harrison, Eckerd College professor of rhetoric and author of Eudora Welty and Virginia Woolf, Gender, Genre, and Influence. And of course, we are joined also by Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer, professor emerita of Millsaps College. So thanks to both of you for guiding our discussions. Remember, if you want to comment, ask a question, it's that reactions button. Click the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. Don't miss out on the chat. There's good stuff there. And now I'm going to turn it over to Susan to begin our final discussion on To the Lighthouse.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Happy Juneteenth, everyone. And I hope you've all had a wonderful day. Oh, it's not, wait, I've had a wonderful day. It's 6 o'clock here. You all are having a wonderful day, or at least I hope you all are.
We're in the midst of it.
Right. I forgot for a moment. And so this is our last discussion of Virginia Woolf's novel. We have reached the lighthouse, and Lily Briscoe has had her vision. And so we want to talk about what both of those things mean in our next hour. But I thought I would start our conversation where we left off last time, when I mistakenly jumped forward into this week's reading to ask about in section 7. We have, and again, this is where we seem to be, we're going back and forth between either James or Cam on the boat and Lily Briscoe still back on the island. And in section 7, we're really with James. It's his perspective that dominates in that section. And he has the memory of the wagon crushing a foot. And it's such an interesting passage, I think. And in some ways, I always find it so unexpected. Looking at the foot, seeing the foot when it's whole, and then seeing it after the wagon has seeing the foot first in the grass smooth and whole, then the wheel, and then the same foot, purple crushed, but the wheel was innocent. So I thought we might start there to talk about this memory that James has, if it even is a memory. And so I wanted to start there and see what your thoughts were about this interesting image.
In my book, it's on page 185.
Oh, thank you, Suzanne.
Mhm. There we have Harriet and Cheryl. I think we lost Cheryl, but maybe. we have
Okay, I
Harriet.
see Harriet.
Yeah, I'm feeling very conflicted about this passage. I think I'm a resisting reader.
I know you were a resisting reader, Harriet.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the creation, the understanding of the father in this chapter, and James's thing that it was not him, the father, that he wanted to kill. It was the thing that descended on him. And when I read that, I actually was kind of confused about which him it descends on. Is it the father that it descends on? That is the way in which he he lashes out at other people, or it lashes out without considering the effect on other people? Or is it the mood that the damage that has descended on James, and that is the darkness that he wants to stamp out? But then when we get to and I'm not sure it's a memory as much as a kind of mental analogy about the wheel and the crushing, and the idea that the wheel was innocent. And I also feel in this passage, James recognizing the way in which he is become his father, the way in which they are, the way in which they alone knew each other. That there is a sense of his wanting to quote the same lines of poetry that his father spouts when he's unconscious of the others around him, but rather feeling a music or poetry that is the only thing of interest to him, rather than the effect he's having on his children. I have to say that I've also this week been reading Louise DeSalvo's book, biography of Virginia Woolf, which looks at sexual abuse
Yes.
in Virginia Woolf's story, and I'm sure it's very controversial in Woolf studies, but she does report Woolf repeating that she had been sexually abused from the age of 6 by her half-brothers.
Right.
But what the book actually does convincingly prove is that there is a culture of abuse towards women, that it has affected the children in her family. There's Laura, the half-sister, who'd been institutionalized because she didn't read well enough, and dies at 75 in an institution.
Institutionalized the whole time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Or Stella, who is made the little mother, and needs to tend Leslie, particularly around the death of his wife, or Virginia. I have to, one message I have to share. It reminds me so much of Charles Tansley. This is the story of Leslie Stephen's nephew publishing in the Cambridge Review this poem, which is, a piece of drivel. If all the harm that women have done were put in a bundle and rolled into one, earth would not hold it, the sky would not enfold it, it would not be lighted nor wanted, nor warmed by the sun, such masses of evil. And I'm going to skip to the end of the poem when she turns it around. If all the harm that was done by men were doubled and doubled and doubled again, and melted and fused into vapor, and then were squared and raised to the power of 10, they're nearly enough, not near, to keep a small girl for the 10th of a year. That notion that women are depravity and that men are superior intellectually, I read this book and I feel about the father a sense of people are many things.
Right.
That I'm a resisting reader to the idea of innocence, or to the notion that or that there's something going on, like the kind of thing that happens to an abuse victim when they both feel the trauma and also want to protect the family member that they want to love, or that keep them safe. So that my riff.
It was a very good riff, and we haven't talked about Salvo's book in this discussion, but it was, yes, it was very, very controversial, continues to be, but and I think that she does document very clearly the number of times Woolf claimed to have been abused by her brothers. And then also the disbelief that Woolf encountered in those claims, I think she puts into this context, the context of the poem you just read. And so it is a very, very interesting, for those of you who want to pursue it, it is a very interesting read and a very interesting analysis. And it's she ties it to the episodes that have been, long after the fact, kind of diagnosed as bipolar episodes or schizophrenic episodes that Woolf suffered on and off throughout her life, and ties that to the sexual abuse. Monica.
Well, I want to point to the section that just introduces the wagon at the top of 185, which is both some gorgeous writing and also, I don't know, this Indian section seems to be tying up a lot of the themes of the whole novel, but the turning back among the many leaves which the past had folded in him, peering into the heart of that forest where light and shade so checker each other that all shape is distorted, and one blunders now with the sun in one's eyes, now with the dark shadow. He sought an image to cool and detach and round off his feeling in a concrete shape. And that's where he then goes into suppose then, which seems like this is a thought experiment to try to express this feeling that he doesn't know how to express. I find it, I love this concept of a forest of memory, in which everything is dappled and the sun gets in your eyes and you can't quite see straight. That it does an interesting thing of tying together these themes of looking and then vision that we end the section with Lily's vision, that it is kind of the challenge of seeing, and the relationship between seeing and vision that seems to be just gorgeously encapsulated here.
I think you're right. The language there is just amazing. Marcia. Oh, Marcia, you're still muted.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So I was interested in the way in which this section, this style, we haven't, I mean, to me, To the Lighthouse is a story, and it has characters and plot, but it's also a fabulous style, the modernism that that she uses to tell the story, tell us about the characters, get into their minds. There's a passage, it's later on, that I'm just going to quote. I don't have your same edition, so I have my old college edition. One had constantly a sense of repetition, of one thing falling where another had fallen, and so setting up an echo which chimed in the air and made it full of vibrations. That is such a statement of how Virginia Woolf writes, and how it's, and the section about in James's mind is a good illustration, which I wanted to point out. Before the purple foot business, it's when he's talking about his father and he'd like to kill him. He says, the thing that descended on him, we've talked about that. It's this darkness, without his knowing it, perhaps, that fierce, sudden, black-winged harpy with its talons and its beak, all cold and hard, that struck and struck at you. He could feel the beak on his bare legs, where it had struck when he was a child. Well, that image is exactly the same image that Mrs. Ramsay, that describes Mrs. Ramsay's reaction way back in the window when she's sitting with James and her husband comes up and basically he's demanding her attention and her sympathy. And the language is, into this delicious, she's happy sitting there with her son. Into this delicious fecundity, this fountain and spray of life, the fatal sterility of the male plunged itself like a beak of brass, barren and bare. He wanted sympathy. He was a failure, he said, blah, blah, blah. the same image, the same imagery, the beak, cold and hard, that struck. She uses that, Virginia Woolf uses that to describe this feeling that descended on James and the feeling that descended on Mrs. Ramsay. And it's so clearly intentional. And it then later when was that part about one thing falling where another had fallen, and so setting up an echo which chimed in the air and made it full of vibrations. That is so much the way this novel is written. And it has nothing to do, well, I just wanted to talk about that, the style. It's, to me, it's just marvelous. There's even a place where in the Lily Briscoe section, which was where that part about setting up vibrations, where she uses the word floundering. And I don't know whether anybody, the flounder is the fish and the fisherman and
Right,
and,
right.
and not the mackerel, which was, they find the boy fishes on the boat going to the lighthouse, the flounder. And the whole, that it's an, I know she didn't do it accidentally. I know she wanted me to have a sudden thought, oh my God, it's like the fisherman and his wife. And Lily Briscoe has just been thinking about how powerful and sometimes people dislike her for it. Mrs. Ramsay's, the great power she exerts over people. And that is really the point of the use of the fisherman and his wife, referring to that story in the very first section. It is to let you think that Mrs. Ramsay, for all of her wonderful qualities and connecting people, taking care of her husband, bringing people together, she has a desire for power that is really not admirable. And well, I've said that I'm the one who always says that Mrs. Ramsay isn't the best. and
Well,
Lily Briscoe thinks it too.
absolutely. And I think that Mr. Carmichael does too.
Yes,
I think that he
he's
sees
the one
it.
that doesn't fall for her, right?
Yeah.
Well, and I think that, I think that that's one of the things that Woolf does throughout this novel is that, you start to feel this connection with a character and then it's undercut because of the way somebody else is seeing them. And we talked last time about the way in which there are real parallels between Lily Briscoe and Mr. Ramsay. And in this chapter, we're seeing the real parallels between James and his father. And so, there again, the novel, it's, I think, for most of us as readers, it's hard to really like Mr. Ramsay because he is so difficult and he is so demanding. And so much of the time we're experiencing him through Lily Briscoe's eyes. And she is, even though they do manage to find that blessed island of good boots, of beautiful boots, that so much of the time she's feeling a demand that she doesn't want to have to meet. And so it's very difficult, I think, to really say, oh yes, Mr. Ramsay is my favorite character in the novel. At the same time, you can't dismiss him. And I think that we see James really thinking about this. This is on page 184, exactly when he's talking about a little further down from the passage that we just talked about, that James says, the black wings spread and the hard beak tore. And the next moment, there he sat reading his book. And he might look up, one never knew, quite reasonably. He might talk to the McAllisters. He might be pressing a sovereign into some frozen old woman's hand in the street, James thought. And so, the novel constantly makes the point that no one is ever one thing. And she's always really looking for that complexity. And and it's not just people, on page 186, it's also all of the imagery, all of the metaphors she's playing with in the novel, We have James
Mhm.
looking at the lighthouse. He could see the whitewashed rocks, the tower stark and straight. He could see that it was barred with black and white. He could see windows in it. He could even see washing spread on the rocks to dry. So that was the lighthouse, was it? No, the other was also the lighthouse, for nothing was simply one thing. And I think that that echoes throughout. Suzanne.
I see this passage with the foot of James sort of coming into his own.
Okay.
Rather than casting blame on his father,
Yeah.
you know, the wheel was innocent. How am I
Mhm.
going to, how am I, James, going to manage this world and this black harpy descending on me? It seems to me he sees his father, yeah, as he sees the lighthouse as more than one thing. It's his mother that he still idealizes and cannot see her and her complexity.
Right. And it is interesting because I think earlier in the novel, we see James as really allied with Mrs. Ramsay. And here, James, and through James, the reader, are starting to see that James isn't just one thing, that he really is as much his father as his mother, and probably more his father at this point. Harriet.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I was thinking too of the ways in which James thinks about she. I'm down where a little bit further beyond passage we've just been discussing about the lighthouse being this and that.
Mhm.
It's his memory that she had gone stiff all over, and if there had been a knife or anything with a sharp point, I can't help thinking over to Faulkner and the conversation between Mr. Compson and Quentin when Quentin has been fighting, and the repetition is, oh, you were protecting your teacher. But the idea of abusing women and of protecting them, or abusing the family members, and at the same time wanting to protect women, it does sound like we've got James in a repetition of the male culture. And then you've got Cam, who we haven't really talked about yet. And Cam, who is trying to construct her father alternately as tyranny and as safety. If he's there, then she's safe. Although the next thing we know is that she's wandered into the drowning ship, the shipwreck, and the drowning, and again the repetition of alone and doomed. So we got these two different children responding to their the repetition of their parents' interaction. It's not one parent or the other, it's a parental repetition.
And now they're both tied in an alliance, fight tyranny to the death. And they're also at odds with one another because they're no longer in the same place in that alliance. And they're no longer in the same place in their feelings, especially about their father. And so, and there's even that, I know we're getting kind of ahead of ourselves, but there's that moment where Cam is watching Mr. Ramsay finally praise James. And that's just such the complexity of that passage is just wonderful, but she's saying, okay, now he's got it. And now he's going to pretend like he doesn't care about it. So it's just such a wonderful passage. Joellen.
I just want to point out before we leave this section that there are just echoes of might, which is partly what drives James crazy, is the unpredictability of his father. But then we get might and smite. And James, early in the window, is even imagining bringing a knife or a scimitar down and stabbing his father in the heart. And the images of hands going up and coming down, mostly stabbing to this point. And I'm not going to jump to the end specifically, but they're exceedingly
Yes.
great developments of that theme. He talks about the garden where there was no throwing about of hands, but we heard a lot about hands. And both Mr. Ramsay and Mr. Carmichael are men
Mhm.
whose hands come down differently.
Yes. And, the bird with the beak is following that same motion, that same downward stabbing motion. Monica.
I'm glad that Harriet brought up Cam because I'd like to think about Cam. There are two things in this section that really struck me. The first is just, when you read something and it resonates. I was recently pushed myself to the edge of my comfort zone, and to deal with my fear, I narrated it in my head like I was a character in a novel. And this is what she does on 188. She she begins to tell herself a story of adventure and escaping a sinking ship. And I think that's so fascinating. The people in this novel who use art, who use narration, who use literature as a way of dealing with life. So there's that, but there's also, and we've kind of mentioned this, how Cam, part of what this story, this ending is it's Cam and James, they're both adults, but whenever you're around your father, you suddenly turn into the children that you were, and immediately you're taking is he gonna like go over to his side, and we're fighting fascism, and so it's just fascinating how both your community and your location like turn you into these people.
And in between James's chapter or section and Cam's, we come in section 9 back to Lily Briscoe. And this is another one of these. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about what Woolf is doing. This is another one of those parenthetical sections. I mean, all of 9 is a long parenthetical statement. And so what we have, we have Lily Briscoe standing on the island, looking at the boat as it's moving toward the lighthouse. And we have Cam in this next section, looking back at the island and seeing it, small it was, shaped something like a leaf, stood on its end, with the gold sprinkled waters flowing in and about it. It had, she supposed, a place in the universe, even that little island. So we have, we've talked a lot about vision and about looking. And so we have a real emphasis here. It's really setting this up that those on the boat are either looking toward the lighthouse or looking back at the island. And Lily Briscoe is looking at the boat, looking at the sea, but then also looking at her painting. So the play there with vision is just fascinating. And Lily says, and this is on page 188, distance had an extraordinary power. They had been swallowed up in it, she felt. They were gone forever. They had become part of the nature of things. And so that play with distance and closeness, I think, is also part of what we have, part of what we then see in Cam's kind of reverie, as she is both there in the boat with her brother and father, but also using that kind of narration to gain some distance. Cheryl.
Okay, so first regarding Cam's imagination, in trauma therapy. So if Mr. Ramsay is a tyrant that holds his household hostage in a sense, because your behavior has to be, whatever behaviors you exhibit must be approved of by him, that would relate to trauma. And one thing that happens is disassociation and avoidance behaviors. So that whole imagination story thing, that's what I thought of when I read this passage. And then regarding how nothing is the same and all the opposites we see here. When Lily, because I'm pointing this out because Lily Briscoe did not finish that painting 10 years ago. And so my question is, why didn't she finish it 10 years ago? And I think it's because Virginia Woolf is exploring the transition and growth of femininity during this first wave of feminism that Joellen pointed out that I looked up. And so when Lily's painting, Woolf says that Mrs. Ramsey is in the window, she's an august shape, the shape of a dome. But when Lily and Mr. Banks are looking at the painting, Mrs. Ramsey is a triangular purple shape. That's not a dome. And that's it.
Mhm. Yes, and that triangular shape echoes Mrs. Ramsey's feeling of being a wedge of darkness. So yes, those echoes are just so profound the whole way through. Suzanne.
This is maybe a bit simplistic, but I'm thinking of distance here as artistic distance.
Yeah.
And Cam is the fiction writer and Lily as the painter. And what the artist has to have is some distance from material. You make something out of the material, but to do that, and then the act of doing it, you are pulling back from it and seeing it from that kind of artistic distance. So.
And we see Lily doing just that with the painting as well. Joellen. Oh, Joellen, you're muted.
Sorry. I can't resist pointing out that the beginning of section 11, when we're back in Lily's mind on 191, begins, so much depends then. Echoes, so much depends, she thought, upon distance. Absolutely. And we've got a wheelbarrow in this thing. I think absolutely echoing the Williams poem. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain, water, among the white chickens. Anyway, and we've got chickens as part of the vision. It's just, it really can take me places.
Yes, I can't ever hear that phrase, so much depends, without that poem just kind of springing full formed.
And the poem itself was published in William Spring and all in 1923 and published in France first. Anyway, given the embedding of Woolf in that whole culture, she had to know it. I mean, I'm not going to go beyond that, but
no, but that's wonderful because I thought the same thing. And in fact, like you, I looked up the year of publication of that poem because I thought
I was just doing.
and I've never noticed that before. So that was just wonderful. Harriet.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I too looked it up. And it's not just that phrase; it's there several times throughout the novel, and it made me think about thingness. Somebody commented earlier about how maybe the truth is in the simple interactions. Is not the philosophical, not the gentleman in the library, but in the knitting needles, or that the thingness turns out to be very important in this novel, as well as in the wheelbarrow.
And I started thinking of the wagon as the wheelbarrow, I have to say. So I think those references are just fascinating. Other thoughts or observations anyone wants to make about Cam before we do move on to Lily Briscoe and to her long contemplation of Mrs. Ramsey again. Yeah, Cheryl.
I just want to reiterate Cam's description in the window. So Cam the wicked, James the ruthless, Andrew the just, Prue the fair. and just how headstrong Cam is described as being. And to think about that, and as we're moving through the to conclude the novel.
Mhm.
And that's all.
And that's that vibrant, energetic. Cam's the one who's always just racing by, who Mr. Banks is always kind of vaguely hurt because Cam won't stop for him, won't interact with him. She's the one who is just kind of pure energy and motion. That's very different from the Cam sitting in that boat and thinking about the protection that she wants from her father. Joellen.
And in this section, Cam is the one who points out the role of books and reading.
Yes.
That's just
yes.
really highlighted.
She's the writer. Mhm.
Well, yeah, at least, yeah, but she thinks of the gentleman in the library turning
Yes.
their pages, reading the news. And when her father, she describes watching her father when he's reading, and he looks up, and he's like Mrs. Ramsay when he would ask her as gently as anyone could, was there nothing he could give her? So this is just another point where the parents are pulled together to some extent. The book that's been in his pocket, this is 190, 2/3 of the way down. Reading it or writing rounds off his edges. So she's recognizing change as her father in a different way. By the bottom of that page, he's plunged into his reading, and on he went, tossing over page after page. And she went on telling herself a story about escaping from a sinking ship, for she was safe while he sat there. And there's something safe about being with men when they're reading, at least. But by the end, she also, and she on 191, second paragraph, she's talking about the island being very small, its place in the universe. It was very distant now. But by the end, she's murmuring, it says, dreamily half asleep, how we perished each alone. So there's just some real coming together of viewpoints and the importance of both reading and writing.
Mm-hmm. And still in that refrain, how we perished each alone, is also fascinating to think of the novel through that lens. And the ways in which the characters really struggle to connect with one another, and that those moments of connection disappear so quickly. And so you have their feelings for one another changing so dramatically from one paragraph to the next paragraph. So that desire that we see from Mrs. Ramsay for that unity represented by the dinner, all sitting around the table with the candles lit, it is so fleeting. And you know, and that refrain of we perished each alone crops up in a number of different characters' minds. Harriet.
Yeah, the novel is fascinating on the topic of reading and
Yes.
in general. But I was also looking at the passage that Joellen has been quoting as we're thinking about, and you know, moving from her sense that that she's safe. Safe, she felt herself when she crept in from the garden and took a book down, but then not safe as we are in her understanding of the ship that sunk and drowning, and I can't help thinking, dabbling her fingers in the water. A ship had sunk, and she murmured dreamily asleep, how we perished each alone. I can't help thinking across Woolf and Welty now, because we've been talking about the similarities. We've been talking about the opposites that are close together. We've been talking about the mystery of the other in Welty's work, and now seeing it in Woolf's. But I'm also struck with the difference that is, I'm thinking, Sarah Ford has been part of our discussion often as she's working on a book on the ways in which Welty rewrites the narrative of the drowned woman in numerous scenes across. And I can't help thinking that we're looking at Cam talking about drowning when, in fact, it's a prediction of what Woolf will do. Will drown herself.
Right. Mhm.
And the connection between Cam and Virginia Woolf. I just feel it in that scene so strongly.
Mhm. Yeah. Suzanne.
I have a question. I just wondered if you were if we could talk about William Cooper and the Castaway and the role it plays here, because that is the poem that they
Right.
are
it
constantly
is.
quoting. And
Mhm.
Leslie Stephen was an 18th century scholar. I don't know, did he write about the Castaway?
You know, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it would have been part probably of the literary culture of probably the family of the time. I mean, I think he would certainly have known about it. The family, obviously, Virginia Woolf has a very clear awareness of it and awareness of the memory of it. So, but you know, that's a good question. I don't know if Leslie Stevens wrote about it, but it is threaded through this novel. And I think that Harriet, it's a very sobering, that whole theme of perished each alone really does remind us of Virginia Woolf filling her pockets with rocks and walking down the lawn into the river. And that sense of isolation and perishing. Cheryl.
I just want to note that I took one of Monica's classes where we did the awakening, and those
Yeah.
themes were also explored there in that novel.
Yes. Well, and I'm noticing the time and I'm getting nervous, as I always am at about this time in all of our discussions, because I don't want us to not get to the end of the novel, where, and at the same time, there's so much to talk about between now and then, between this passage and the next. So I was just looking at, on page 192, where you have Lily Briscoe talking about the feeling of completeness. And again, earlier, she's looked at the steps and seen the curlicue with emptiness at its heart. And here on page 192, we have her saying, empty it was not, but full to the brim. She seemed to be standing up to the lips in some substance, to move and float and sink in it. Yes, for these waters were unfathomably deep. And so there again, we have the waters, we have the image of either drowning or floating. Into them had spilled so many lives, the Ramseys, the children's, and all sorts of waifs and strays of things besides, a washerwoman with her basket, a rook, a red hot poker, the purples and gray greens of flowers. Some common feeling held the whole. It was some such feeling of completeness, perhaps, which 10 years ago, standing almost where she stood now, had made her say that she must be in love with the place. Love had 1,000 shapes. There might be lovers whose gift it was to choose out the elements of things and place them together, and so giving them a wholeness not theirs in life, make of some scene or meeting of people, all now gone and separate, one of those globed, compacted things over which thought lingers and love plays. And we did just go see Midsummer Night's Dream. And I have to say, I read that and I thought, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. And that idea, though, that this is where love and the artist are one and the same, and that the artist's work is a work of love, which it's one of my favorite passages of the novel. And yet it's no time later that we see Lily in tears again. On page 202. And she says, Mrs. Ramsay, she cried, feeling the old horror come back. To want and not to have. Could she inflict that still? And then quietly, as if she refrained, that too became part of the ordinary experience, was on a level with the chair, with the table. Mrs. Ramsay, it was part of her perfect goodness, sat there quite simply in the chair, flicked her needles to and fro, knitted her reddish brown stocking, cast her shadow on the step. There she sat. Monica.
I was actually going to point to 202, the top of the page, going back to what Harriet mentioned. I think we've talked about this all along. This is Lily says, when wanted, she thought, dipping her brush deliberately, to be on a level with ordinary experience, to feel simply that it's a chair, that's a table, and yet at the same time, it's a miracle, it's an ecstasy. The problem might be solved after all. So it's in this like thingness that's at the same time the miracle of existence. But that contrast with right at the next section, James sees Mr. Ramsay, and Mr. Ramsay looks as if he had physically become what was always at the back of both of their minds, that loneliness, which was for both of them.
Too loud then, isn't it?
No.
The truth about things. So we've got these, we're kind of getting like these different perspectives of Lily Briscoe seeing kind of the miraculousness of life that's existent in like these concrete things. James sees loneliness is the truth about things. So there's this difference between like the miraculousness of things and the loneliness inherent in things on these two pages.
And of course, I always think when Lily is thinking simply that's a chair, that's a table, it's not the abstract idea of a table hanging in the tree that is associated with Mr. Ramsay. It is being in the present and experiencing, like we've said, that thingness. And that's the artist. You know, it's I love it that this sentence includes her dipping her brush deliberately. Kelly.
This whole passage about these ordinary items and this thingness reminded me of my favorite sort of passage in The Waves, in Woolf's The Waves, which says, how much better is silence, the coffee cup, the table? How much better to sit by myself like the solitary seabird that opens its wings on the stake. Let me sit here forever with bare things, this coffee cup, this knife, this fork, things in themselves, myself being myself.
Mm-hmm. Joellen.
I wanted also to point out that Lily paints concrete things abstractly.
Yes.
And that strikes me as kin to the top of page 202, where that table and chair were both ordinary and miraculous. I think she brings them together. It's not just things. And that somehow, I guess I'm not sure I can link this back to that exactly. But at the bottom of 192, when you were reading that wonderful passage about globed, compacted things, which thought lingers in love's play, I want us to remember that Mrs. Ramsay was described as a dome, something of a globe over things. And I think that paragraph pulls together a kind of completeness about thinking about Mrs. Ramsay that we can chart along and pushes us toward this recognition on 202.
And on 202, it is though, it's Lily Briscoe who has created Mrs. Ramsey and this perfect memory. I mean, so this is Lily Briscoe bringing this kind of filling this absence with this presence through her artistry and her memory. And in essence, bringing Mrs. Ramsey back to life, and recognizing and that I think is so much connected to The Optimist's Daughter and the way in which Laurel's mother comes back to life in that novel through the memory and also the artistry of Laurel McKelvehand. So I think that this is a passage to me that really is about the artist. And so okay, Cheryl, I can go on, but I'm going to stop.
I think much of the novel is about the nature of art and finding, as the quote that Kelly just read about being able to be yourself as the person that you are, and the ordinary and miraculous being the same. Back in the window where Lily's walking with Mr. Banks, and the miraculous thought image that she has of the table where Mr. Ramsey sits at and does his reading and his figures and thinks about the square root of 1,253 is upturned in the tree. It's this beautifully creative, innovative thought of a table upturned in the tree. And as you pointed out, Suzanne, how the one section of the novel ends just with the word awake. So Lily becomes awake to who she is, and Minta and the brooch that she loses, and Minta marrying Paul, and Paul having a mistress. But this is actually the kind of relationship that's perfect for them. That's so maybe that's also a nod to the time passes, so society passes into new things, where Minta is cool with her husband having a mistress, possibly because she's a lesbian, I don't know, but the only thing she's afraid of in the natural world is when there's a bull in the field, like maybe men. Maybe that means men. Yeah.
Harriet.
I'm thinking about the other artist in Lily's section, which is Carmichael.
Yes.
Carmichael, who is the famous man now called Carmichael. She smiled, thinking how many shapes a person may wear, that they know each other. I mean, this turns out to be one of the most successful relationships. And they're only because they mumbled at each other on the staircase. But this was one way of knowing people, she thought, to know the outline. She thought that she knew, she never read a line of his poetry, but she thought she knew how it went, though, slowly and sonorously. It was seasoned and mellow. And she thinks that many times in the same thought, and that they're sharing some in spite of, so Carmichael is, it made me wonder how many times, whether this book has been read as a play, and do we know who Carmichael is, and Charles Tansey in terms of actual characters out there. I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that Carmichael is another artist who is portrayed as at work.
And on page 208, and I do want us to get to the end of the novel here. It is very interesting that Lily Briscoe says he has landed, and this is, it's not they. He has landed, she said aloud. It is finished. Then surging up, puffing slightly, old Mr. Carmichael stood beside her, looking like an old pagan god, shaggy with weeds in his hair and the trident, it was only a French novel, in his hand. He stood by her on the edge of the lawn, swaying a little in his bulk, and said, shading his eyes with his hand, they will have landed. And she felt that she had been right. They had not needed to speak. They had been thinking the same things, and he had answered without her asking him anything. And it continues with this imagery of him. Now he has crowned the occasion, she thought, when his hand slowly fell, as if she had seen him let fall from his great height a wreath of violets and asphodels, which, fluttering slowly, lay at length upon the earth. So it's just, again, it's one of those, this is one of those passages where I think, you know, the poetry of it completely exceeds the sense of it in some ways. It's just so beautiful. And then we end the novel here. She turns at this and, you know, looks at her picture, thinks it would be hung in attics, it would be destroyed, but what did that matter? She asked herself, taking up her brush again. She looked at the steps, they were empty. She looked at her canvas, it was blurred. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, she drew a line there in the center. It was done, it was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue, I have had my vision. Harriet. Oh, Joellen.
Oh, yeah, I love the way this ends. It's really just beautiful. And the Carmichael's hands coming down and
Yes,
scattering the flowers
the hands
is an
again.
echo of Lily's vision after Mrs. Ramsay's death, of her
Yes.
wearing the wreath of flowers and walking away. I think violets is the common term. And also at the beginning of this section, wait, no, 204 is where I think, anyway, where Ramsay has his hand up, it brings it down as though he's directing a symphony.
Right.
And at the end of Lily's section, the long section, she's kind of done with Mrs. Ramsay and she's looking for Mr. Ramsay. She needed or wanted Mr. Ramsay. And that just, it all just comes together exceptionally beautifully here, including with the letter Q, which you'll notice at the bottom of 208. Paragraph begins quickly, as if she were called. And this is the fast strike, but Q, tracking Q through here, qualities, is really very interesting. And maybe some of them have gotten to R.
Well, and perhaps Lily has at the end. I think, and flowers, tracking flowers and the motif of flowers all the way through the novel is just fascinating, because we have them in the window. I mean, it's just, it is a wonderful, and culminates there with, you know, Mr. Carmichael crowning the occasion. So we have Lily Briscoe's vision, and we have the lighthouse. I'm gonna end by saying, what's the lighthouse? That's what the novel is called. We start out not being able to go there. We end, and we end getting there. Lily Briscoe's language. He has landed, she said aloud. It is finished. And it's certainly come full circle from the opening of dreaming of going to the lighthouse. Marcia.
Well, I'll just say the obvious. It's a quest novel. I mean, To the Lighthouse tells you right away that the very title tells you that it is a quest theme, and we have each person with his or her quest. For Lily, it's the artistic quest. For Cam and James, I think it is the quest to reconcile their growing self, their growing sense of self and their own destiny with their childhood, which is definitely a quest, the quest to become an adult and figure out where you fit between this powerful mother and this sulky, powerful father. I'll just say it that way.
Right. And I think it's also a quest to try to recreate the world after the devastation of World War I, and the time passes, which, you know, time passes really captures that sense of the complete interruption and the experience of World War I bringing things right up to the brink of complete dissolution. And then in the Lighthouse section, there's an attempt, especially on the part of Lily Briscoe, to try and retrieve and not retrieve, but recreate meaning. Joellen, and I'm
Yeah, very
Jessica's
quickly.
hand is up,
The quest to the lighthouse, I mean, it's
Yeah.
used in all kinds of ways, but is Mr. Ramsey's. And by the end, Lily announces that he gets there, but we also see that his children note that he does not bring the occasion back to himself, but beneath the rougher sea. He declines to quote, he asks nothing of his children. This man who would whine for his wife's affection has changed.
Right. And he praises his son. Mhm.
Yes, yes.
Harriet.
I was just remembering that DeSalvo says the lighthouse, lighthouse beam is associated with a need for parental protection, with the idea that we're looking at the light, which should keep us safe. But I was going to say something else, which is I think that the lighthouse suggests again the relationship between thingness and interpretation.
Right. Okay.
That we are looking at a thing which will be interpreted many different ways. I'm sure it has been, and that we're what we make of it is taking the thing and making it into an abstraction as we interpret it.
And it's interesting that after they've landed and Lily Briscoe is looking out, that what she does is paint a line down the middle of her painting. And, you know, the line could well be the lighthouse as well. And that could be part of Lily Briscoe's artistic vision at the end. And yes, Jessica.
Well, this has been wonderful, and I just want to thank everyone for being part of this discussion. Please help me thank Suzanne Mars and Susan Harrison, especially for treating us as such a wonderful read through this novel. So thank you very much to you two instructors. A tradition by now is we like to share our next book club pick at the end of every series. So as you know, we alternate works by Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. Our next book is going to be a collection of works by Welty and others themed around civil rights leader Medgar Evers. This month of June marks the 60th anniversary of Evers' assassination in 1963, to which Eudora Welty responded by writing her short story, Where Is the Voice Coming From? Published in the New Yorker just 25 days after the shooting. Numerous tributes of Evers' life and legacy are ongoing in the city of Jackson this month. And so we're going to break for the summer and pick up on September 11th. And do about 6 weeks featuring that story and several other works that are dedicated to or inspired by Medgar Evers. You can follow us on social media at Eudora Welty House on Facebook and Instagram for further updates. If you're signed up for Welty at Home emails, then you will automatically receive updates for this discussion. Our first email for that will come out on September 8th, the Friday before the September 11th discussion. So with that said, thank you all. This was wonderful, and I'll see you on September 11th.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Susan for leading us so well. Thank you, Susan.
Well, I want to thank you all. As I just said in my comment in the chat, I can't wait now to go back and reread To the Lighthouse. This discussion has just opened up some new ways of thinking about the novel. So I'm going to look forward to doing that over the next few weeks and look forward to joining the reading group in September. Thank you all so much.